Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So I wanted to start off and talk about this blog that Microsoft has put out talking about the Cybersecurity Governance Council that was actually formed in 2024. And they're introducing these named members in this blog series, which started in April of this year. And then the latest one, there's been 3 of them so far. The latest one was just a few days ago. And it talks about each one of these members, what their responsibilities are, and their goals and priorities as part of being in this governance council. And what's important to remember is we have a CISO at Microsoft, right? A CISO who is named, who reports to Charlie Bell, who directly reports to Satya Nadella. And our CISO is Igor Zygansky, and he is in charge of the office of the CISO. And now we have this governance council, which have named deputy CISOs. And these deputy CISOs, that's not their day job. They have a day job, and we can talk about what their day job is, but then they also have this secondary responsibility as a deputy CISO to look at additional threats specific to their area of expertise, to guard against threats that might be things that would secure Microsoft solutions, Microsoft platforms, the company itself, or the customers. And so before we dive into that, since we are talking about Microsoft and the things that are involved in Microsoft, we usually have a disclaimer that we'll go through. And Adam, if you will,
Do the honors. Yeah, absolutely. So Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We work in our field security sales organization in different parts of it. However, we do this show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. We're very appreciative that Microsoft has a very generous social media policy that allows us to do a show and express our own interests and opinions without direct oversight or editorial control from our employer. We recognize not everyone has that opportunity, and we're very privileged and appreciative of it. As a result of that, we don't take that privilege lightly and, of course, want to maintain the good graces of our employer. However, we think cybersecurity is something we should always be looking at through an academic lens. That is, what are the facts? What can we learn from it? How can we grow from it? And what can we share with our listeners and viewers? And so that's the lens through which we bring these conversations to you. Is we think this is interesting. We think there's value. We think there's something to learn from it. And you can too. However, we just want you to be aware of any potential conflict of interest. We, of course, try to, again, evaluate things fairly and without bias or other undue influence. But we think our listeners and viewers should know where we work and who signs our paychecks. So with that, Andy, let's get on with it and talk about this Cybersecurity Governance Council at Microsoft and the deputy CISOs that make it up, and some really good advice and interesting takes from them. I think there's some really interesting stuff here, and I'm excited to get into it today.
Yeah, so each one of these blogs, we're just going to go over the first one here, and that's important because one of them is the deputy CISO for identity. Maybe in other podcasts we'll talk about the other ones, but these blogs for the Cybersecurity Governance Council is a Q&A. They do like an interview, and then they record their answers here. So really good questions, some really good answers. But in this first one, they introduce Jonathan Zunger, who is a corporate vice president. He's the deputy CISO of artificial intelligence. And his job is to really try to think about all the different ways in which AI can go wrong, make sure that Microsoft has good, thoughtful plans for each one of those things, and then develop the right tools so Microsoft can design and run the right incident response for AI issues. Igor Sanknov is the CVP, corporate vice president, and deputy CISO for identity. So his day job is actually the CVP of engineering for identity. He reports to Joy Chick, who is the president of identity, and he leads the data and platform engineering along with business-facing initiatives. But then since this governance council was formed in 2024, he's also serving as that deputy CISO focused on identity-related risks. I thought it was super interesting that we have an entire deputy CISO dedicated to just identity risks. I know that like identity has been this thing that we've talked about in security for so long, yet it is still top of mind as a threat vector, as something that needs to be, a whole person dedicated to it on the Cybersecurity Governance Council here. And then Mark Rustovich, who is the
Rusinovich.
Sorry, how do you say it?
Rusinovich.
Mark Rusinovich, who is the Azure CTO. He's the Chief Technology Officer, and he's the Deputy CISO for Azure. So in his role, he looks at and he works with a large team to identify and resolve security risks that come up and evolve under the Microsoft Azure umbrella. The core operating system itself, the groups that make up the core engineering systems that the entire company depends on. And in these cases, Microsoft wants to mitigate some of these risks so that they're durable. And once they're done, the system stays in place and doesn't have to be revisited each year. So that's the three that were introduced in this first blog series. And as I read through this, one of the things which I thought was a really good take on the question was, what are some of the biggest cybersecurity misconceptions that you encounter? And Igor replied, the desire to make the perfect solution. This is why assume breach is the mindset I cultivate with my team. We must focus on protection at all costs, but we should expect that any protection will be circumvented. How we detect, reduce impact, and mitigate in the shortest time is top of mind. Mark replied, the assumption that unless you prove to me something is not secure, it is secure. You, of course, must invest in protection, and Microsoft has said for close to a decade now that you have to assume any system can and will be breached, so you have to minimize the impact and increase how you detect and mitigate those breaches. And Yontan replied, the idea that security, privacy, and safety are three distinct things. They're not. If you've seen a security team say, that sounds like a privacy problem, and a privacy team say, that sounds like a security problem, nobody fixes it, and you know where the story ends. Official boundaries like these are factories of nasty incidents. Mark and Igor kind of had the same blended idea where you have to assume breach and then you have to focus on that mitigation, how you respond to that. And then also Yantan, I just thought it was great that someone says, okay, it's not my job. Another person says it's not my job. And all of a sudden now it's nobody's job. And that's how things happen. So someone has to step up and say, okay, let's get this done. So anyways, I thought that was really good. You can read through the entire blog. We'll have the link in the show notes. They have some really good insights. And we're going to focus really on Igor's job because he published a blog that we're going to talk about in this in this episode about evolving identity techniques.
This is really interesting, and I'm glad you shared this, Andy. And if you've heard us talk about either on this show or other Microsoft people talk about the Secure Future Initiative, or SFI, this is one of those things that came out of that initiative, was the creation of the Cybersecurity Governance Council, of the Deputy CISO role as a secondary role in addition to their day jobs, and bringing them together to provide those unique domain-specific threats. And I find it really interesting, and something we can take away from this as our viewers and listeners. Take, for example, Igor Sakhnov, who is that CVP of Identity Engineering, and then also has that secondary role of Deputy CISO. Who better to understand the threats facing identity than the person engineering the identity platform? And that is exactly the kind of mindset we need to cultivate across all our organizations. Is security isn't just the job of the security team. It's everyone's responsibility. It's the shared responsibility of everyone at the organization. I always harken back to one thing I love about the Delta Airlines safety briefing is when they talk about safety, they say it's the number one responsibility of the captain and crew, but also the shared responsibility of everyone on board the aircraft, which is 100% true. You need all of the passengers to participate. If you have an evacuation, if people are trying to pull stuff out of the overhead bins, it's going to slow the evacuation and make it unsafe. As an example, everyone has to participate. Same with cybersecurity. And so I love that they're literally asking a gentleman who's responsible for engineering the identity platform, what are the big threats we need to be concerned about? What do we need to be protecting against? What should we be watching for? And we're building that, thinking about securing the platform as we're engineering the platform. And that should be in everything you build in your organization and what you do at your organization. People building new solutions, people creating solutions or modifying solutions, always thinking about how do we secure this solution by design and by default. So I love that mindset that this cultivates. And then I find it interesting that as they interviewed these three gentlemen, that Igor Sakhanov and Mark Rusinovich both gave more or less the same response. And I sincerely doubt each one was aware of the other's response. They were independently interviewed and they happened to give very similar responses, which they both talk about effectively. I love Rusinovich's comment on just because you can't prove something's not secure doesn't mean it is perfectly secure. Effectively, you should assume, as we say, assume breach, assume breach. We've been saying that forever, but what's that really mean? It means we should look at every solution and look at it with that critical eye and say, there's probably a vulnerability in here. There's probably a way to bypass this. This is not bulletproof solution. So how do we create defense in depth? How do we increase and speed up our time to respond and our time to mitigate? And how do we do that at the speed and scale we need to protect our organization? And those are great questions to ask. And Igor's mindset as well was the same thing. Everything will be circumvented. So think outside of that. Instead of, well, we're on CrowdStrike, so we're good. They're the best. We've got cybersecurity has been solved. Instead, think about, okay, well, if that doesn't work, then what do I do next? What are my other detection methods? What is my defense in depth? How do I detect identity-based threats? So on and so forth. So just really great overall food for thought here from leaders who see some really creative and novel attacks and the kind of mindset they cultivate amongst their teams. Really, really valuable to understand here. So great stuff, and excited to dig into this identity stuff more, because for longtime listeners of the show, if there's a sweet spot for both Andy and I, we love the identity stuff. And we think it's still basically the front door to most attacks. And so it is where we should put most of our engineering effort in hardening and securing our organization. So let's get into it.
Yeah, and then one final thought just on the Cybersecurity Council. I thought this was just an interesting concept that organizations could have, because you could make your own Cybersecurity Council in your own company. Right?
100%.
You could look at areas that, while the CISO or whoever is in charge of security is in charge of the overall security, you can bring in people for a council that are experts in their own domain. Maybe
Absolutely.
You're hosting things on AWS, and so you have the person who's chief of engineering for AWS, and you bring them in on this council and say, okay, you are obviously in charge of maintaining the platform, maintaining availability, and making sure that everything stays running, but what are you doing? How are you securing that? Essentially the question. What could you do more, or how are you afraid that someone could bring down the platform from a security aspect, right? Physical security could be one thing, customer experience or whatever. So like each area, you can bring in someone into their council. And I think we've long talked about something like this, maybe security champions, but that's like pushing security initiatives out, I think. Whereas this is, you're bringing in people who are experts in their domain, and then you want to have their opinion heard on, how they can secure their area of expertise. So I think this is something that easily you could do at your own company.
And should do, right? I mean, this is a terrific idea. And I've worked with a lot of cybersecurity teams, and they're very bright individuals. But one thing we have to adopt as cybersecurity professionals is that growth mindset, that learn it all mindset, that we cannot possibly know everything. And so asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And so when we bring in folks from other parts of our technical organization and learn from them and learn what keeps them up at night, what are they concerned about, and we build that into our overall security practice, we're only going to be stronger as a result of it. And we just can't know it all. There's things you just have very little visibility into. You have line of business applications probably being developed in your organization. And maybe you do have someone who really cares about software development, like lifecycle and securing that, but you can still learn from them. you could still learn from the identity folks. A lot of cybersecurity folks are not super comfortable with identity. So bring them in. And this is just a great idea that everyone can adopt and implement in their own organizations.
All right, so let's get into it here. Igor Segnov published this blog about defending against evolving identity attack techniques. And I read through this whole thing, and it is phenomenal. A lot of what he publishes here is a direct result of Microsoft threat intelligence seeing advanced threat actors, nation state threat actors using these techniques. And so there's a lot of threat intelligence in here on what type of attacks they are, who's using them. And then he has a whole section on how to protect and secure against this stuff. Right off the bat, before he even gets into it, he talks about phish resistant and passwordless solutions like passkeys. And that is something, like we've obviously harped on MFA for a very long time. And there are still organizations, if you can believe it, that are not 100% protected with MFA. We've evolved beyond that now. Like I would probably go as far as to say as it is a requirement to be on phish resistant MFA. Like everyone should be on passkeys. If you already have MFA deployed, it's trivial. You just register that same device as a passkey and you're good to go. And then with, your privileged accounts, your admins, you use, the FIDO2 keys, the actual physical keys that are required. So I would go as far as to say that is a requirement, especially with, he gets right into like adversary in the middle, phishing as a service, Evil Jinx being open source. We did a whole episode on Evil Jinx.
Very early on, one of our first shows.
Yeah. And so, with that type of threat vector, you have to have phish resistant MFA these days.
Yeah.
So
Andy, that's such a good take. And I don't know if I've seen someone put it so succinctly, and it's spot on at this point. I'm with you. Like password plus MFA at this point, I perceive that as weak and old school. Like not only is that table stakes, like that's yesterday's table stakes. Like today, you should have a plan in place now, yesterday, for how you are going to get to 100% phish resistant MFA across your organization. Like if you do not have that well down the planning and implementation phases, get on it. Like at this point, there is no effort you could undertake that delivers more security value than that. There's nothing you can do that will harden your organization more than that. So just get on it. Like you can do all these phishing exercises and teach people not to click links and teach all these things, or you could just fix the problem. Right? Like it's one of those. I love the way Igor put it and you put it. Like just let's do it. I recognize there are some challenges, but really today it's generally available in the Microsoft Authenticator app. If you're already using Authenticator app and number matching and the passwordless technology, it's just a different passwordless experience with a one-time enrollment. And it's effectively for most end users, they don't really see it as any different. But it's actually dramatically different and dramatically more secure.
And so we're talking about using the phish resistant, but also, have some sort of risk-based conditional access policy, right? So we at Microsoft talk about conditional access as a condition to authentication. So you must satisfy this condition. And obviously there are a ton of different static-based conditions that you can have. MFA being primarily, if you're using Entra or any other IDP, MFA, of course, is the first condition. It shouldn't be at this point the only condition to get in. You should have other conditions. Maybe it's signing in from a trusted IP. Again, that should not be the only condition and should also not be a condition where you disregard something else, right? So like if I come from a trusted IP, don't use MFA. That is a bad idea. So there should be multiple conditions that have to be satisfied coming from a trusted IP, using MFA, using phish resistant MFA, coming from a known good endpoint, right? Something that is managed and safe. So these are multiple different conditions that have to be resolved. But if possible, you can use something with Entra, or maybe, I actually don't know of other IDPs that have some sort of conditional access, risk-based conditional access policy built in. I think Okta does have some sort of threat intelligence built in for some of them. But we have a very good way of evaluating risk when it comes to a sign-in. So it could be a sign-in risk, it could be coming from a known IP, but also we have integration with devices. So Entra has that integration with device status, IP address, and then they do real-time and offline detection of that risk, that sign-in risk or user risk. So sign-in risk is just of the individual sign-in at that point in time, but user risk looks at everything across the board, email, device, and we have all those signals across the Microsoft suite where we can determine whether or not there's a high probability that this user, based on their activities, based on everything else, is compromised. So if the user risk gets triggered for medium or high, or the sign-in is medium or high, you can have additional conditions, conditional access policies to say, okay, you must now come from use phish resistant, or you must re-authenticate using MFA or something else, or block that sign in completely. So start using things like that. And then also recommending you use something like a zero trust network access, like global secure access. That is coming back into the play with that trusted IP. So with ZTNA, you can use a SaaS service like Zscaler or Microsoft, where you say, okay, all your traffic must go through this trusted endpoint, and then you have satisfied that condition. And so just as a side note, Global Secure Access, which is Microsoft's ZTNA solution, Entra Internet Access, and Entra Private Access, those have been out for a while now, and TLS Inspection is now in public preview for that. And so we know, encrypted traffic is really the standard in a lot of cyber threats. So they're using that to hide, advanced malware payloads, stealthy exfiltration attempts from within. So TLS Inspection is a way to route that traffic through the Microsoft Security Service Edge, where it is decrypted in real time and inspected. Mm-hmm. Of course, a lot of people have opinions on TLS Inspection. It's still a widely used method for defense. This is as a service. And just like with anything else, TLS inspection has been around for a while. We maintain that decryption and the TLS certificates. If your application has like certificate pinning, you'll have to make exceptions to that. And so you can always make exceptions to what you need to. But anyways, just wanted to mention that. So these are multiple different ways to protect against that phishing as a service, evil jinx, those adversary in the middle attacks.
Yeah, good stuff here. Again, going back to what we said at first, the number one mitigation is to move to phish resistant solutions like passkey, like hardware security tokens. Those defeat evil jinx 100% and attacker in the middle. You can use some of these other technologies as well. If you use zero trust network solutions and you demand that traffic is routed through them, that also defeats this. If you move to risk-based models, those can defeat it some of the time if it's detected properly. And your condition action as a result of detecting elevated risk in the sign-in or the user has to be something that's going to either require another control that cannot be satisfied, or it's going to block the connection. So it can't be require MFA. That won't defeat it. If your action is, require a managed device, if we detect the risk is higher, require a trusted network endpoint, those can defeat it with the combination of, hey, this looks weird. This is a weird sign-in. Nobody's signed in from this proxy site in Russia before. That's weird. This is an elevated sign-in risk. Then you have to chain that with, as a result of the elevated sign-in risk, I'm now going to require, hey, is this device managed by Intune and compliant? Well, no, it's not, because it's some weird proxy. Okay, blocked. I'm going to just block all high sign-in risk. Okay, maybe potentially blocked. I'm going to require, if I detect elevated risk, that it comes through my ZTNA solution. Okay, that could also. But for a lot of these, it gets down to, okay, you could do that with risk, or you could just do it all the time. Ultimately, I mean, our gold standard at this point, Andy, and what we would advise organizations is, at a minimum, your conditional access policy should be always require MFA, always require a compliant device. And if you have a ZTNA solution in place, require the traffic to originate through it. That would be kind of a gold standard to me of really significantly hardened access. And that would pretty much defeat these attacker in the middle type attacks. Or the other way you can do it is with phish resistance. Now we go back to the first part of this podcast where we gave credit to, if I should never assume a solution is completely bulletproof and can never be defeated. That's why we build this defense in depth. That's why we chain all of these things together, because attackers may be able to someday figure out a way around phish resistant MFA. I don't know. Attackers are smart, but maybe they can't then defeat the control for the ZTNA solution. And so our defense in depth has still kept us secure. That's why we don't just put all our eggs in the one basket of phish resistant MFA will solve all the things. We're still going to require other things as a result of it. And that just makes us better and more secure over time. So we're always building defense in depth in everything we do.
Igor has this whole section on device code phishing. And I thought that was super interesting because it is a relatively new technique, but it has been incorporated into multiple threat actors like with their attacks. And it's not something that is commonly talked about. And so let's first talk about what device code is. Device code is where you're being authenticated to a device where all future connections from the device are treated as if they belong to that particular user. So when you're using that same device, it's usually you, and it's basically indirect user authentication. So imagine that you're trying to log into something on a device. It could be a smart TV, it could be a printer, it could be something that actually doesn't take input, like a keyboard, and you have to log into it, and that system sends you like a short code, like an alphanumeric 6-digit code, to a secondary previously registered and authenticated device like your phone or an iPad or another portable device, and you get that prompt to log into that first device, and once you do, you are authenticated and logged in. Sounds like something that you probably have done, like for example, authenticating to Netflix on your TV. You might get a QR code to sign in, and then it says, okay, sign in on your device and use this code, or any other streaming service.
You name it, ESPN, HBO Max, yeah, all the things, Hulu, they all do it. Right.
We do this in our personal life and we don't even think about it. Device code is authenticating that. We're not actually typing in our username and password, but we are authenticating it to it using a user ID and password. That token is then passed to the device and you are authenticated to that. And so how do attackers really take advantage of this? Well, they do it in a corporate environment, right? Like if you are invited to like a fake Teams meeting or some sort of phishing email or chat message, and you click on it and that link is legit and belongs to Microsoft, but then you're asked to provide device code to authenticate. So you type in the code or the service, and then that authenticates that device, which is actually the threat actor's device, as being legitimate. So now the threat actor's device is authenticated as one of your corporate identities devices. And so that can be easily, once you have access to that, now they have access to your services and whatever else that you possess legitimately. And so it's something that has been taken advantage of, and really it's easily blocked. Like there's conditional access policies, and it's something that has shown up. It's probably been around for maybe a couple of years now, but people don't revisit like conditional access and see, all these different things that you can do. We recently did a whole show on conditional access deep dive, but this is just something that's easily, like, if you don't need people to authenticate through device code, and something that you can easily make an exception for if there is a corporate need for it, but then block everybody else, you just block it. Just go to conditional access, block authentications for all device code, and you're done. And the threat this threat vector is completely negated, right?
I found out the name for this recently, and I've advocated for it on the show many times, but I didn't know there was a name. And now that I heard it, I love it. We ran one of these internally at Microsoft. They called it a scream test, where you turn something off or turn something on and you wait to hear the screams, and that will tell you if you need to create exceptions for it. And this is probably one of those things where your most effective solution is run a scream test. People will let you know if they need this, and then you can determine if there's business validity to those requests and exceptions to carve out. But for the most part, I'm with Andy. Turn this off and wait to hear screaming. And likely you're not going to, except for a very couple of isolated cases. And either you need to carve out exceptions or you can educate on a better way to handle it. So definitely I would get this turned off org-wide and find out where you need to carve out exceptions, and then use the granularity of conditional access policies to do exactly that.
Igor has a whole section on OAuth consent phishing. And this is something, again, we've talked about before, but where your users will consent to a third-party application with certain permissions. Very commonly, you can get a malicious consent link, and then that app will then have those permissions within your organization. This is a very common threat vector. You can easily go in. So, of course, the default, if you haven't gone in to look at app permissions, is for users to consent to using their corporate Microsoft identity to consent to these application permissions. It's wide open to begin with, but you can change the default. And I suspect at some point we may change that default with the SFI initiative to something that is more secure. But right now it is still open, and you can change it to multiple different ways. You can say allow low risk with verified publishers. You can say admin consent only. You can specify specific custom permissions as an organization that you've deemed low risk, and then they can automatically consent to those. We have our CASB solution, Defender for Cloud Apps, where it can look at all the different highly privileged OAuth applications, and you can evaluate those. But the first thing is kind of cutting it off, right? Like make sure that you're only consenting to low risk permissions or admin consent only. And again, you can run a screen test here, right? Because this is not something that happens all the time. So if you make it admin consent only, you're going to get a request at some point and say, hey, we have this application that we need. And then you can evaluate. And a lot of times the low risk ones are usually ones that don't have any huge implications, but every once in a while you'll get one that's high risk, and you'll push back as a security organization and say, hey, why do you need this? And then obviously go back and look at all those other applications that have been consented. You can always look at the number of users that are using it. I've done this in the past where I've gone and looked at different applications that have, even if they are low risk, like for example, I worked at a bicycle company, Trek Bikes, a long time ago, and there were people who were consenting to Garmin. Not a huge risk, but it had GPS data involved in it. And so you go back, and there was only like a handful of users who consented to Garmin using their corporate identity. And you could ask them, hey, do you still need this? Like, can you use a personal account instead of using your corporate identity? And they are usually pretty open to that. So it's something that you should definitely have a project to comb over if you haven't done that already. Device join phishing is another thing that can be an issue. So make sure that you have authentication strengths like MFA for registering a device. At Microsoft, we have a notification and an email that triggers every time we join a device to Entra.
And it goes to your manager.
It goes to your manager. Yes. And so the manager should, if you don't, our policy is actually the manager should reach out to the individual and say, hey, is this you? I usually just kind of
I do it proactively. Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of waiting for them, I just say, hey, this is me. I'm, just joining a new device on the weekend, blah, blah, blah. And they're usually good with it. But yeah. And same thing with MFA. You should have a trigger for MFA. There was I can't remember, what's the IR service that was just acquired by Google that's commonly used? Mandiant.
You said
right?
Recently, and it made me not think of Mandiant because that was a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But Mandiant, I think they had that breach. It was the they had a breach that was pretty big, and it was the reason why they found it was because they had an email that triggered when the threat actor registered a new MFA for an employee that was phished. And so that email triggered, and the employee luckily followed protocol and said, hey, they escalated it to security, said this was not me, someone registered a new MFA, and then they were able to do their investigation and find out that they were actually compromised. So that should definitely be part of it. And then, of course, risks beyond just phishing for email, right? Like you should have policies in place for phishing with Teams. And we actually do have threat intelligence that looks at threat actors that are abusing Teams, where they're creating like fraudulent tenants, creating Teams meetings, and sending chat messages to potential victims using that. And they also, like as recent as November 2024, threat actors are compromising tenants and directly calling users over Teams to phish for their credentials as well. So this is just, again, more cannon, fodder for the cannon. Like, make sure that you don't have credentials, right? Like, you should be on a passwordless path, because for Microsoft employees, if someone were to ask me for my password, one, I don't know it. I have to look it up. And two, we don't use passwords. And so like anytime I have to be asked to put in a password or like ask for my password, I immediately know that that is usually a fraudulent request, right? It's a phishing attempt. So you can't phish me for my credentials because I don't know them and I don't use them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a red flag.
Right. I mean, we've been saying that for years, but it's so true. And I always used to laugh because I did still know my password for a long time, and I eventually have forgotten it now. I don't know what mine is. It did finally happen because it became ubiquitous, and it was a slow boil. I mean, I've been at Microsoft 8 years, and I still had to use my password sometimes in some circumstances, and it just over time became less and less. And then I didn't have to rotate it anymore. And I knew it even less. And so I haven't rotated it in years, and I don't even know what it is. So, I mean, it's hard to compromise when I don't have it in my brain to give out. But it's one of those things, and this word gets overused, of journey, but it truly is a journey where you're reducing your reliance on it till you hit the point when you don't use it at all. And then the next stage is you remove it from the directory service entirely. And we're not there yet. My password is still hashed somewhere in some Active Directory instance. It's still in Azure Active Directory, Entra ID. Wow, I just dropped the old name as well. It's still there, but I don't know what it is. And at a certain point, we can blast those hashes away, and that will be a glorious day.
Yeah, so there's so much more in this blog, and we could go on for a while, but it's definitely worth your read. We'll put the link in the show notes. But at the end, there's recommendations throughout each one as he's talking about these threat vectors and threat actors. But at the end, he consolidates all of the recommendations. So if you want like a TLDR, just scroll down to the recommendations that you can then review and evaluate as a security team. One of the ones that actually jumped out at me is allowing MFA and passkey registrations only from trusted devices and trusted locations. And this one is interesting because I know we have this at Microsoft. I cannot register an MFA or passkey on something that is not a trusted location or a trusted device. And it has come to kind of bite me because in demo environments, I often have to register an MFA, and sometimes you're logging into that demo environment because it's ours. We can log into it from a private browser or whatever, from a non-trusted device, but I can't register the MFA from that browser, which is a pain. So, and because of single sign-on, right, it automatically signs into the device, the browser, the regular browser. And so there's all these like checks and balances. And so oftentimes for my demo tenants, I have to disable the policy because it's automatically put into our demo tenants. Must register MFA and passkeys from trusted locations and devices. I have to disable it. And then that gets flagged, of course, because like it's not instantly, but it does get flagged, and I'll get flagged for it. And then I can register my MFA and then I turn it back on. It is something that can be a pain, but it's definitely recommended because for the most part, you should only be registering your MFA and passkeys from a trusted device, from a trusted location, and, as well as getting a notification for that. So I think that's a really good one. It's not something that is often, I have seen at companies, but I know at Microsoft, we definitely do that. So this is definitely worth your time to review, look at, read. Again, if you want the TLDR, just jump to the recommendations at the end. It's something that we've talked about. Identity is something we've continued to talk about for the last few years, and it will continue to be something that we talk about as long as passwords can still be phished and identities can still be compromised. So this is still the attack vector that is easiest for threat actors to exploit. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information along with the links to the articles that we talked about in the show will be in the show notes. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.